Okay, let's look at this now. I have 100x squared minus 25y squared. Whenever I go to factor something, the first thing I always start is with step number 1. Look for a common factor. And if I look at the 100 and the 25, actually there is a common factor of 25. That has to be my first step. This is what's called factoring completely. But any type of factoring, when you're asked to factor, you want to factor completely. So you look first for a common factor. So 25 goes into 100, that gives you 4x squared. And 25 into cancels into this 25, so it just leaves you minus y squared. So my first step in factoring this expression was to take out the common factor of 25. Once I've finished, I then look at what's inside my parentheses. That's a 4x squared minus y squared. And if you notice it, 4x squared is a perfect squared. It's 2x times 2x. Y squared is a perfect square. It's y times y. And there's a minus in between this. This is the difference of squares. So I can go further on this. I leave the 25 on the outside, and I write my two parentheses. I'm going to do 2x and 2x. And I'm going to do y and y, do the square root of each of the terms. And in one I put a plus, and in one I put a minus. Notice it doesn't matter if you put the minus first and the plus second, but one has to be positive and one has to be negative. So that we end up with a common factor of 25, a 2x plus y, and a 2x minus y. Now, I really gave this as a trick. Because if you looked at the 100x squared minus 25y squared, you would have said, oh, that's the difference of squares right away. It's 10x and 10x, 5y and 5y. But if that's how you factored it, as 10x plus 5y and 10x minus 5y, you did not factor completely, because you first want to take out that common factor, and because that makes it simpler. You want to end up with as simple polynomials as you possibly can. So be very careful with that as to looking for a, very good, Reggie. See, Adina, that was, you did a good job, but you see where you made that mistake. You did not factor completely. So always look for that. So again, here's our progression. Step number 1, and this is a step that a lot of people forget. See if there's a common factor. Okay, take care of that. Step number 2, well, look how many terms you have. If you have 4 terms, try to group. If you have 2 terms, try to do difference of squares. Okay, what happens if you have 3 terms? What if you have a trinomial? Okay, so that's my next case. The most common type of factoring actually is trinomial factoring. And the reason I left it, obviously it means that there are 3 terms. And the reason I left it for the last case, is we're not even going to finish it, is because there are really so many different options when you're doing trinomial factoring. So we're going to see, you don't have to worry about factoring anything more than a common factor if you have more than 4 terms. But always look for a common factor first. And then after you've taken care of your common factor, or if there is no common factor, count how many terms your polynomial has. because it'll either have 2, 3, or 4. If it has 5, you can't go any further than a common factor anyhow. If it's 4, try to group it, use the grouping method. If it's true 2, try to see if it has the difference of squares. If it's 3, then you were going to do this trinomial factoring. Now, so for the rest of this period and continuing into Thursday, we're going to be talking about trinomial factoring, and I just need more board space, so that's why I'm erasing this. A trinomial in general is something that looks like 3 terms, something like ax squared plus bx plus c. For example, I might have 2x squared minus 7x plus 2 would be a trinomial. We're only going to be dealing first with trinomials that have only one letter. It could be x, it could be y, it could be a, whatever it is. After we can do trinomial factoring with one letter, we'll take into consideration what happens when we have 2 letters. But let's just talk about one letter. The coefficient, the number in front of this square term, the x squared, is what we call the a. The b is the number that's in front of the x term. The c is the number that stands alone without any x's. The method that we use is sometimes called the AC method. And the reason we call it the AC method is because in this method, what you do is you take your leading coefficient, your a, which in this case is 2, and multiply it by your last number, which is your c. Okay. That's the method we're going to use, and I'm going to describe how that method works right now by doing a specific problem. And I'm going to start with an easier, this actually, I just made this up, so it probably doesn't even factor. So let's try something that I know is going to factor. Let's say I gave you this example, x squared plus 7x plus 2. Here's a trinomial. We usually get, if we recall, what gives us a trinomial when we multiply? 2 binomials. Usually when we multiply 2 binomials, we mentioned this before when we're doing multiplication. When we multiply 2 binomials, we should get 4 terms. But very often, the inner and the outer terms, remember we're doing FOIL, so there are 4 terms, but the inner and the outer are usually like terms, so that when we simplify, instead of having 4 terms, we end up with 3 terms. That's how we end up with a trinomial. What we're going to do in this AC method is take our trinomial and try to put it back into the 4-term expression it really was before the like terms were combined. And once we have 4 terms, of course, then we can use grouping. So that's what the essence of the AC method is. So let me do the AC method. Of course, we have to do a lot of different examples because they're just different nuances. In this case, my A is 1 because the number in front of the x squared, there's no number there, so it's obviously 1. And my C is 12. So my AC is 1 times 12, which is 12. And obviously it's positive. Okay? It's a positive number. What we're going to do is we're going to take this trinomial And we're going to work on getting this middle term, this bx, this into two numbers, so that we'll have four terms. So we're going to leave the x squared alone. We're going to leave the plus 12 alone. What we're working on is trying to break up this 7x into two pieces. Now, there are lots of ways you can break up 7x. You could have 1x and 6x, 2x and 5x, 4x and 3x. There's so many different ways that 7x could be broken up. We want to specifically break it up in a way that was originally given before it had been combined. And the way we do it is we look at for two numbers that multiply to AC. So we need two numbers that in this case multiply to 12. That's my AC. And add or combine, let's use the word combine, to 7. In other words, to the middle number, that B. B is by 7, my B is 7. I'm looking for two numbers, so let's think about it. We're looking for two numbers that are going to multiply to 12 and add to 7. And these are all positive, notice. Well, can anybody think of any numbers that multiply to 7 and multiply to 12 and add to 7? Anybody? Think in the chat. Send me a chat. Perfect, Adina. 4 and 3. Perfect. The two numbers that she came up with was a positive 4 and a positive 3. Think about it. We knew they both had to be positive because my product was positive and my number was positive. So we thought of two numbers that multiplied to 12 and added to 7. So I take this 7x and I break it up into two pieces, 4x and 3x. Of course, I have to put the x next to it. I just work with the numbers. So I have taken this trinomial and broken it up into 4 terms, because in 4 terms, I now can use my grouping method. Remember how we group? We look for the first terms. The two first terms are x squared and 4x. Then as a common factor of x, so that'll give me x plus 4. In my second group, I have a 3x and a 12, which has a common factor of 3. And that gives me x plus 4 inside. And just like we did before, we take our common factor, just put this over here, x plus 4. Goes first. And in the second parentheses, the two things that are on the outside, x plus 3. And if you did x plus 4 times x plus 3, this is exactly what you would get. You would get x squared plus 7x plus 12. Let's just try it out. X times x, remember we're doing FOIL, would give me x squared. Outer would be x times 3, which would be the 3x. Inner would be 4x, 4 times x, which would be the 4x. And last would be 4 times 3, which is 12. And of course, the 3x and the 4x gave us the 7x. So what we're undoing is FOIL. And we're doing by remembering that we're looking for numbers that multiply to AC and add or combine to the B. Let's try another example. Again, this is called the AC method, which is really a combination of breaking down your trinomial and using grouping. Suppose I gave you this, x squared minus 14x plus 48. Let's work on this. And let's see if we can do a couple more of these. There will be homework on factoring on Delta Math. I will not give you the trinomial factoring yet. I'll just give you some of the other types of factoring we did. Okay, but let's look at this. Again, my A is 1 and my C is 48. So my AC is 48. And let's just write down what the B is. The B is negative 14. I want to break up. I want to find two numbers that when I multiply them will give me a 48. And when I combine them, they're going to be give me negative 14. Now I can really discuss the signs, the SIGN of these numbers without actually knowing the numbers. Because I know when I'm multiplying two numbers, if the answer is positive, it means either the two numbers are positive or the two numbers are negative. A positive times a positive is positive, a negative times a negative is positive. It can't be a combination of a positive with a negative because then my final answer, my AC would have had to have been negative. And since the B is negative, it must be that both numbers are negative. The only way I can get negative is if I get this thing to be negative. So there are going to be two negatives here. Okay, so I'm looking for two numbers that when I combine them, they're going to give me negative 14. And when I multiply them, they're going to give me positive 48. Can anybody think of any numbers that basically add to 14 and multiply to 48? Perfect. Negative 6 and negative 8. Because 6 times 8 is 48. Negative 6 times negative 8 is positive 48. And negative 6 plus negative 8 is negative 14. So I'm going to break up this negative 14x into negative 6x and negative 8x. The whole point of this is to go back to the four terms that we got from doing FOIL before we combine the outer and the inner. And now we can do our grouping. In the first group, I have a common factor of x, so that's x minus 6. In my second group, remember I'm starting out with a negative, so I have to include the negative. And 8 goes into both of these numbers, so it's negative 8. And negative 8 into negative 8x is x, and negative 8 into positive 48 is negative 6. And again, we have that common binomial factor, so we put that in front, the x minus 6, and x minus 8 goes second. Of course, it wouldn't have been wrong to put the x minus 8 first and the x minus 6 second. Doesn't matter what order you put the parentheses in, just make sure that you have the right sign with the right number. If you have other ways of doing this kind of factoring and it works for you, then just do it the way you know. I want to do one, we have time to do one more. I'd like to do one more. So let's look at this example. X squared minus 6/7 minus 16. Let's say I wanted to factor that. Now remember, our A again, I haven't done any in which the A is anything different than 1. This is going to be 1 times negative 16. So my AC is negative 16. And my B, coefficient of the X, is negative 6. Okay, again, we're going to leave the X squared alone. We're going to leave the negative 16 alone. What we're trying to do is to break up this negative 6 into 2 terms. And we need them to multiply the negative 16, those 2 numbers, and when we combine them, when we add them, we want to get negative 6. Now let's keep in mind, since the AC is negative 16, it means that one of the numbers is going to be positive and one is going to be negative. We can't have them both positive because then the AC would be positive. They can't be both negative because again, the AC would be positive. Since the AC is a negative number, my 2 numbers that I'm going to break this up into is going to be 1 positive and 1 negative. And remember, we want them to multiply to the negative 16. Okay, so we know we may have to multiply to 16. But when we combine them, we want it to be negative 6. And remember, when you're combining a positive number with a negative number, you're essentially subtracting. So what numbers, really, if you think about it, are numbers that multiply to 16, but when you subtract them, give you 6. And obviously that combination is 8 and 2. And now we have to be careful. Do we want the 8 to be the positive or the 8 to be the negative? And when I see that the B is negative, it means I have to take the larger number to be the negative number, which means the 8 is going to be the negative and the smaller number to be the positive. Whenever the middle to whatever sign this is, if the sign is positive, then the larger number goes with the positive. If the sign is negative, then the larger number goes to the negative. So when your final term, when your AC is negative, you're going to be looking for a positive number and a negative number. And you're going to always take the sign of the number, the larger number, to be whatever the sign of the B is. So we're going to write this as a positive 2x and a negative 8x. Notice 2x, a positive 2x combined with a negative 8x does give us negative 6x. And notice also 1 is positive and 1 is negative. And now we're going to do our grouping. In the first group, we have a common factor of 2, of x, so it becomes x plus 2. In my second group, I have a common factor of 8, but it's a negative 8 because the middle term, the leading coefficient of the second group is negative. So I put a negative 8 in front of here, and this becomes x, and negative 8 into negative 16 is plus 2. So we see that our common factor, our common binomial factor is x plus 2, and x minus 8 is the other number. Again, it wouldn't have been wrong to write x minus 8 first and x plus 2 second. What would be wrong is if you put the minus with the 2 and the plus with the 8. the larger number has to be the negative because the B was a negative number. Okay, we're gonna stop right here. And again, if anybody wants to redo their test, just send me an email. I will see you on Thursday. Don't forget to check for homework on Delta Math.